Oke, eh, saya mulai ya perkuliahan kita hari ini adalah pertemuan ke-15, minggu ke-15, masih tentang Mesir. Ini kayaknya ada beberapa yang saya minta tolong jadi co-host dulu deh ya, supaya kalau ada yang masuk bisa bantu saya. Ini sebelum ini nih, mumpung masih hot. eh, Kalian ini kuliah saya satu aja apa sambil nyambi kuliah yang lain ini?
Satu, Bu.
Oke, kalau gitu bisa bisa diterima dengan fokus ya. Kemarin itu kami kan mengadakan evaluasi kurikulum, kemudian kami meminta masukan dari stakeholder, jadi beberapa ada pemerintah, dinas eh, kemarin itu ya PUPR, konsultan, kontraktor, beragam-ragam bidang usaha di bidang arsitektur. Tahu nggak yang terpenting? Jadi kalau dari segi kurikulum tuh kita tuh sudah diajari banyak gitu ya. Nah, sehingga banyak tapi dikit-dikit ya kan, kan semesternya supaya kamu cepat lulus. Kalau zaman saya dulu tuh kurikulumnya 5 tahun. Nah kalau kalian kan 4 tahun. Terus sehingga kalian diajari banyak hal, dan tentu saja kalianlah yang harus eh, mengkulik bagian mana yang kalian paling bisa. Jadi kalau kalian lebih suka kemarin itu zaman dulu itu yang namanya penelitian tuh nggak banyak anak suka. Sekarang ada konsultan bilang berpikir ala peneliti itu ternyata penting untuk menciptakan sebuah desain yang pas dan sebagainya. Jadi kalian udah diajari dikit-dikit nih. Kemudian macam-macam lah. Ada yang tertarik dengan manajemen konstruksi, ada yang BIM, atau itu setiap mahasiswa harus melakukan penggalian-penggalian lebih dalam pada bidang atau mata kuliah yang kalian suka. Nah, jadi intinya semua tuh melihat kurikulum kami itu tahu, oh ya kami sudah mengajarkan itu semua. Nah, yang jadi masalah, yang kalian mungkin, bukan kalian mungkin, pengalaman saya sih, eh, kalian nganggapnya itu setengah hati, tapi saya sudah mencoba selalu mengingatkan presentasinya yang bagus. Kemudian saya minta kalian terbiasa dengan TikTok, tapi masih ada anak-anak yang malu. Dan, nah, justru itu loh yang menurut sebagian orang itu anak-anak tingkat itu masih lemah di public speaking. Pada penuh percaya diri, menyampaikan pendapat, penuh PD dan taktis untuk mencermati informasi, kemudian cerdik bertanya, kemudian cerdik memikirkan eh, apa yang harus saya lakukan. Nah, ini saya ingatkan kepada kalian, ternyata itu adalah hal yang sangat penting yang bisa membantu kalian untuk memenangkan persaingan dengan fresh graduate lain pada saat nanti lulus. Jadi bisa gambar, semua pasti bisa gambar, bisa ngerancang, bisa mendesain, tapi pada saat Anda eh, punya kebiasaan untuk eh, melihat sesuatu dengan dengan antusias, kemudian menyampaikan, kemudian mempresentasikan, kemudian mendiskusikan, itu adalah nilai lebih yang sangat dibutuhkan. Jadi sekali lagi saya mau ngingetin deh, membuat presentasi itu ternyata menjadi hal yang penting selain IPK. Mungkin sudah banyak anak-anak dari IPK bagus, sudah banyak kampus-kampus juga yang akan men-drill mahasiswanya untuk mendapatkan kualitas tugas akhir yang bagus. Tapi kemampuan untuk mempresentasikan, menunjukkan apa ya, niat untuk berkolaborasi itu yang dianggap masih lemah. Jadi saya sampaikan ini mumpung masih hangat. Jadi kalian kalian mau nggak mau harus menyadari itu, dan tentu saja harus menambal kekurangan itu sejak dari sekarang. Gitu. Ya, cukup bisa didengar jelas ya suara saya ya.
Bisa, Bu.
Ya, mudah-mudahan ini ya memberi kesadaran kalian bahwa itu harus dimulai sejak dini. Oke, sekarang kita mulai materi kuliah tentang Mesir lagi. Ini kita melihat sedikit lagi, bukan sedikit ya, yang kayak scan cepat tentang Mesir sebelum kita masuk ke materi. Itu tadi scan cepat tentang Mesir sebelum kita masukin lagi. Oh, ini ada lagi. Ini berarti versi sambungan. tadi menggambarkan betapa teknologi mereka, karena tadi ya alamnya juga lengkap, kemudian tambangnya juga berlimpah begitu. Nah, ini ada beberapa fakta menarik. Jadi kita sudah mempelajari di Yunani Romawi tentang simetri begitu ya, tapi di Mesir kalau kalian masih ingat simetri versi Mesir itu bukan lebih ya, sudah di atas yang Yunani Romawi, meskipun dengan periode yang sama dengan Yunani, bahwa simetris mereka juga sudah menggunakan metode mekanika visual gitu ya, jadi 3 dimensi begitu. Kemudian kalau kalian masih ingat dulu bahwa ukuran kolom mereka itu tidak tepat sama. Kenapa? Kalau tepat sama diletakkan di padang pasir dengan matahari tinggi yang terpancar di tanah mereka yang panas, padang pasir yang lembut itu membuat fata morgana dan membuat bangunan tampak meliuk. Dan itu adalah teknologi fisika bangunan. Kalau zaman sekarang fisika bangunan kan pencahayaan, nah, itu mereka sudah pencahayaan alam. Kemudian desain arsitekturnya luar biasa, tenaga kerjanya banyak gitu ya. Dia membangun sebuah struktur abadi gitu. Karena tadi piramida ya, Giza, Sphinx ya sampai sekarang masih belum ada yang bisa membangun tiruannya yang digunakan atau bertujuan menghormati para dewa. Nah, kemudian nanti tadi kalian bisa bayangin ya, bentuk piramidanya itu betul-betul bahkan dari apa namanya foto udara pun dia sudah sangat menonjol begitu. Monoteisme, jadi mereka sudah menganut Tuhan itu satu gitu ya, sudah punya kepercayaan. Mereka sudah memahami tentang penciptaan yang menyatakan bahwa atom menciptakan alam semesta. Jadi bahwa pencipta alam itu adalah satu-satunya, itu mereka sudah memahami itu. Kemudian bahasa Mesir kuno tidak memiliki kata, arsitektur mereka tidak memiliki kata bagaimana menyebut seseorang yang membangun bangunan-bangunan itu. Jadi kayak Pimpro-nya gitu. Wah, mereka membuat. Jadi dia tidak hanya mendesain, tapi dia menjadi orang kepercayaan gitu. Nah, ini sama seperti di Yunani dan Romawi waktu itu. Kita lihat lagi nutshell, jadi bentuk-bentuk
For the ancient Egyptians, the Nile River was an important source of food, fresh.
Jadi ini adalah faktor-faktor yang membuat kalau kalian tadi sudah scan cepat itu melihat ada peradaban yang lebih begitu tadi tentang simetrisnya sudah berhubungan dengan apa namanya teknologi visual gitu ya, visual pencahayaan alam, kemudian 3 dimensi, jadi desain keruangannya itu sudah tahu bahwa ada sebuah komposisi yang harus diperhatikan sehingga bangunan itu nanti tidak terlihat melewat di tengah pancaran matahari terik. Dan kemudian pada saat scan cepat tadi kalian sudah membayangkan bahwa peradaban mereka memang jauh melebihi keluar masuk melebihi yang pernah kita pelajari tentang Yunani dan Romawi. Nah, ini kita lihat elemen-elemen keunggulannya yang dia miliki, terutama tadi adalah alam yang memberi hadiah kekayaan, baik mineral, sumber daya alam, bahan baku, dan segalanya, termasuk mereka juga tadi punya kecerdasan yang tinggi begitu untuk mengeksploitasi alam.
For the ancient Egyptians, the Nile River was an important source of food, fresh water, and transportation, Every year, the Nile would flood and nutrients would fill and fertilize land, allowing crops to grow. Unfortunately though, the flood would also destroy their homes, forcing them to build new ones. The commoners would create the frames for their houses using cane. Then they would use clay to coat the frame. In contrast, the homes of the noblemen were a bit more sophisticated. Clay and cane were combined and then placed in wooden frames and left to dry in the sun. These sun-dried mud bricks were then used to create their homes. Cult structures, on the other hand, had to be permanent ones. You see, ancient Egyptians believed in the afterlife, and an eternal one at that. They believed that for their Ka, or soul, to live eternally in the afterlife, their bodies would have to remain intact for eternity in this realm. So they had to create a way to protect the deceased from general damage and grave robbers. The mastaba was born. Mastabas were flat roof structures made of adobe brick that stood 20 to 30 feet above ground. Inside, the mastabas contained chapels where traditional rituals were held. A statue representing the deceased would be placed within the masonry to allow the Ka to find its way into the burial chamber, where the body was located 30 meters down. Mastabas were placed near one another, in proximity to the pharaoh's burial ground, creating an acropolis, or city of the dead. This is Djoser, and his chancellor, Imhotep. Imhotep was a priest, healer, and an architect, and he was to design the pharaoh's eternal home. Being creative as he was, he placed 5 mastabas, one above the next, to create the first ever Egyptian pyramid standing at 204 feet in height, the tallest structure ever built at the time. Now, this wasn't a true pyramid, as it didn't have continuously flat sides extending from base to top, but instead, it's considered a step pyramid. It was made up of limestone rather than mud bricks found in the traditional mastabas. Remember Imhotep and his crazy pyramid design? Well, Sneferu tried to create a true pyramid by altering Imhotep's original pyramid plan, but the project ended up caving in. This is known as the Pyramid of Meidum. Sneferu's son, Khufu, learned from his father's mistakes and went on to participate in the creation of one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Great Pyramid of Giza, the tallest structure ever made by human hands. That was until the Eiffel Tower was erected in 1889. The pyramid was made predominantly of limestone and mortar, and granite was reserved for the king's chamber. It was originally covered with highly polished white limestone. What we see today is actually the core structure of the pyramid. The second pyramid at Giza belongs to Khufu's successor, Khafre. He is also credited for the idea of the Sphinx adjacent to the pyramid. The third and smallest pyramid of the 3 at Giza is the Pyramid of Menkaure, Khafre's successor. The sarcophagus discovered inside, which was believed to be Menkaure's, was transported to England in the early 1800s. Unfortunately, the ship sunk and the sarcophagus remains hidden to this day. It's important to note that each pyramid was smaller in size, and this is most likely due to the dwindling amount of resources. This resulted in Menkaure's successor being buried, not in a pyramid, but in a modest mastaba instead. Due to the lack of resources and a shift in power toward priesthood, ancient Egyptians stepped away from the pyramid and temples became the focal point of cult construction. Egyptians began building to honor a specific god, rather than kings. The largest temple complex includes the Temple of Amun in Thebes. Ancient Egyptian temples in general consisted of 4 parts, the entrance highlighted by pylons, a peristyle courtyard, a hypostyle hall, and the sanctuary. At the entrance, pylons towered up to be about 40 meters high. Before the pylons stood wooden flagpoles made of cedar, stone obelisks, and sculptures of the pharaohs. The peristyle courtyard, which followed, was a square courtyard framed by columns. This was open to anyone in ancient Egypt. The hypostyle hall, adjacent to the courtyard, was not. Access was given primarily to high officials. The hall featured clerestory openings used to flood the otherwise dark space with natural sunlight from above. Finally, the sanctuary, which was dedicated to the sun god and was to be used by priests only. The temple's design used columns to hold up stone purlings or horizontal beams, and slabs were laid on top to form the roof. The columns were decorated according to their orders, each design referring to nature. Eventually, priests began to acquire more wealth and power than the kings, and the new kingdom merged into the late period, when Egypt was invaded by the Assyrians and Persians, the time when Alexander the Great arrived, who designed the city of Alexandria, also known as the Jewel of Egypt. If you enjoyed the video, remember to press like and subscribe if you want to see more architecture stories like this. Talk to you guys next.
Nah, ini beberapa karakteristik arsitektur Mesir kuno ya. Dia sangat monumental dan kreatif. Sudah tahu ya, dengan pewarnaannya, dengan apa namanya, ornamen di sepanjang tubuh kolom dan sebagainya. Mereka menggunakan batu ya. Ini sama seperti Yunani karena memang dia lebih kuat dari Yunani, batunya utuh. Kalau Roma kan dia sudah mulai bisa membuat beton sederhana. Dia sudah mencampur antara batu, bubuk, padat gitu kan, kemudian bubuk padatnya itu dari gunung berapi itu yang memiliki kekuatan untuk mengikat mineralnya. Nah ini batu granit, batu pasir membuat konstruksi. Nah mereka kurang kayu, jadi dia itu nggak banyak punya kayu. Tadinya padang pasir soalnya, terus tapi dia punya batu lumpur yang melimpah. Batu lumpur yang melimpah itu dipanggang dalam sinar matahari yang tinggi, sehingga itu adalah kekuatan dari konstruksi yang mereka miliki. Batu lumpur ini digunakan untuk konstruksi tadi ya, benteng dan sebagainya. Kemudian diolah, ditata begitu. Terus kemudian kuil piramida itu dibangun di dekat sungai Nil karena kita tahu sumber kehidupan itu adalah sumber air, gitu ya. Yang kemudian ya sumber kehidupannya sumber air. Kenapa? Air adalah sumber kehidupan, begitu. Tadi kita sudah melihat videonya. Nah, kalau Nil lagi meluap, banjir, kemudian selesai banjir itu dia meninggalkan kesuburan tanah. Kemudian sungai juga menjadi jalur transportasi gitu ya. Jadi mereka mengunjungi satu tempat dan tempat lain menggunakan transportasi sungai, air. Kemudian bahan bangunan diangkut melalui sungai, terus ditopang di kolom-kolom. Nah tadi kolom-kolomnya itu dihiasi dengan tulisan dan itu sangat-sangat berbeda dibanding Yunani dan Romawi. Nah di masa depan mereka sama seperti Roma menciptakan kota. Di Mesir juga menciptakan kota. Ini contohnya adalah Memphis dan Thebes. Ini kayaknya, bukan kayaknya. Minggu depan kita membahas tentang rumah-rumah tradisional dibuat menggunakan batu lumpur dan kayu. Nanti ada videonya bagaimana mereka menciptakan rumah tinggal dari bahan-bahan bangunan mereka yang sangat kaya dengan kekuatan karena perpaduan antara mineral dengan dengan apa namanya, dengan batu alam. Mineral, panas matahari yang membakar. Gitu ya. Nah ini rumah Mesir. tadi gambaran mengenai rumah-rumah masyarakat Mesir. Nah, ini ada beberapa contoh. Ini 3 bangunan paling populer di Mesir, yaitu Piramida Agung di Giza dan Piramida Cheops sama Sphinx. Kemudian ada lagi kuil Luxor, kompleks religius didirikan 1400 sebelum Masehi ya. Ini 1400 sebelum Masehi ya, setara dengan Yunani, tapi Yunani yang tertua 1700. Nah, ini kuil Luxor. Nanti selain kuil Luxor ada lagi yang lebih tua. 1400 sebelum Masehi lebih tua, karena Yunani itu kalau nggak salah 700 sebelum Masehi. Jadi kalau 1400 sebelum Masehi berarti kan dia jauh lebih lama, karena itu kan sebelum Masehi. Kuil Hatshepsut nanti Ratu Senenus, Lembah Raja. Jadi begini, ini yang bangunan yang penting-penting ya, bangunan paling populer itu 3 ini. Terus ada kuil Luxor. Nah, dia didirikannya karena sangat tua, begitu. Nanti kita lihat. Ini semua kita lihat sudah saya siapkan. Kuil Hatshepsut ini kuil yang merupakan kamar mayat, kemudian Lembah Raja terdiri di atas 60 makam raja dan ratu, gitu ya. Kuil Suci Karnak dan Ampu Singkong. Ini adalah 6 kasus yang kita pelajari per hari ini. Ini Luxor tadi, kompleks kuil Mesir kuno di tepi Sungai Nil, dibangun 1400 sebelum Masehi, tempat suci, salah satu dari kuil utama di timur. Kemudian kuil Luxor didirikan untuk pemujaan atau kesejahteraan meninggal. Nah, ini yang lain-lain itu didedikasikan untuk pemujaan dewa, atau yang dianggap dewa itu ya rajanya Fir'aun itu. Nah, kuil ini didedikasikan untuk peremajaan kerajaan. Jadi bukan kayaknya ya, logikanya memang sudah ada, kemudian dia dibangun lagi untuk meremajakan kuil-kuil yang sudah dibangun. Ini aja meremajakan aja 1400 sebelum Masehi ya. Jadi kalau kita bayangkan sebetulnya arsitektur Mesir itu jauh lebih luar biasa dibanding Yunani. Cuman tadi karena teknologinya kita selalu mengacu kepada Barat Eropa, sehingga pendidikan arsitektur kita itu mengacu pada Eropa, kemudian Eropa diawali dari Yunani. Sementara kita tahu jauh lebih tua ini adalah konsentrasi sih. Maksudnya minimal harus 120 Egypt. Kemudian ini setelah tadi kita mengunjungi Luxor secara virtual, sekarang kita mengunjungi Temple of Hatshepsut. Jadi temple ini seperti apa ya diartikan sebagai temple atau kuil kamar mayat gitu ya, dibangun masa pemerintahan Firaun. Kalau yang ini memang dari nggak ada dibangun dari kalau Luxor tadi kan pembaruan 18 Mesir berlokasi di seberang kota Luxor sebagai Mahakarya arsitektur kuno. 3 terasnya menjulang tinggi di atas lantai gurun di tebing, terletak dalam masjid yang sama ditutupi oleh Elgun, kemudian yang Elgun yaitu piramida untuk kompleks mayat, kamar mayatnya. Dia berada di gurun 1 kilo ke arah timur, terhubung ke kompleks dengan jalan Cikui Lembah, mengarah 3 tiang. Ini fungsi ini dibajak sendiri. Nanti kita lihat seperti apa sih sebetulnya konsep desain yang diceritakan. Oke, kalau sudah dibaca dengan cepat, saya kasih waktu dulu. Nah, sekarang kita menikmati. Oh, ini. Jadi dia pembangunannya berkisar antara tahun ke-7 dan sampai tahun ke-20. Berulang kali bangunannya dimodifikasi, jadi mereka juga trial and error nih. Dipengaruhi oleh kuil Mentuhap dari dinasti ke-11 yang dibangun beberapa abad sebelumnya, 6. Jadi dia punya sumbu diperuntukkan bagi kompleks mayat, kemudian pemujaan kamar mayat dipindah selatan untuk membeli. Jadi mereka bermainnya menggunakan sumbu karena kenapa? Karena kalian bisa bayangkan mereka melakukan perencanaan bangunannya kan nggak pakai gambar kertas seperti kalian gitu ya, sehingga mereka menggunakan sumbu-sumbu imajiner misalnya menghadap ke sana, kemudian ini diletakkan sebelah mana. Jadi mereka di dalam menggambarkan desain perancangan yang ada di benaknya si arsitek itu diawali dengan menggunakan sumbu-sumbu imajiner yang mereka tentukan lebih dulu. Nanti kapan ya kita harus kuliah khusus tentang sumbu imajiner Jogja ya, karena itu mendapatkan penghargaan UNESCO yang hampir yakin sebagian besar penduduk Indonesia juga nggak tahu tuh sumbu imajinernya Jogja dengan tegas begitu. Ya. Tuh, bentar. Bisa. Nggak bisa bagus. Ya.
Queen Hatshepsut was one of the few women that ruled in Egypt as a pharaoh, and she began the brightest moment of the new kingdom in the 15th century BC. She had a tomb in the Valley of the Kings where all the pharaohs were buried at that time. And she had a mortuary temple built in the other side of the mountain so that offerings could be brought to the temple once she was dead. But her mortuary temple is really one of the most extraordinary because it takes advantage of the cliffs and really uses them as part of the architecture and extends the architecture into the landscape so that the scale of the architecture is augmented by the fact that it's almost seamlessly interconnected with the landscape itself. The mortuary temple of Hatshepsut was built in 1520 BC by her architect Senmut. So from this view you can see something extraordinary about this temple, and that is these different precincts that are used to organize the procession do not happen across a flat terrain, but have to do with moving up into the landscape. A processional way of sphinxes connected the temple with the valley. The terraces approached by ramps are in 3 levels, mounting towards the base of the cliffs. Their faces lined with double colonnades, which also serve as retaining walls for the next level. It's like a typical Egyptian temple insofar as there's multiple thresholds, and every time you cross a threshold you get to a space that is increasingly dense and compact, telescoping to the sanctuary. But not only does it move up the mountain, but it also moves into the mountain. The opening feature of the temple is the 3 terraces fronted by a portico leading up to the temple proper. Each elevated terrace was accessed by a ramp, whose balustrade was adorned by falcons resting upon coiled cobras. To the left and right of the face of the middle terrace are chapels of Hathor and Anubis. Since Hathor was the guardian of the area, it is appropriate to find a chapel dedicated to her within Hatshepsut's mortuary temple. The columns that fill the court of this chapel are Hathor columns, the capital of which represents a female head with cow ears topped with a crown. Anubis was frequently represented with the body of a man and the head of a jackal, as he is shown in his chapel. Anubis was the god of the embalming process, and he accompanied dead kings in the afterworld. Here he sits on a throne and he faces a pile of offerings in 8 levels. The wall reliefs on this temple are exceptionally fine, and include representations of the Queen's trade expedition to Punt and of her allegedly divine birth as the child of Ammon. Punt was an ancient territory described by the hieroglyphic texts of ancient Egypt, whose location is still uncertain, although it's thought it could have been located in the Somalia coast. Hatshepsut brought several goods from her expedition to Punt, including this tree. Today they are sand-covered and barren. But in the 18th dynasty, the terraces of Hatshepsut's temple were embellished with incense trees planted in earth-filled pits to create a garden for Ammon's promenades. Bird irrigation pipes supplied water to sustain the plants, and priests placed tributes to the god in the shade beneath the branches. The upper terrace is a walled court lined with a further double colonnade, flanked on the left by the Queen's mortuary chapel and on the right by a minor court containing an enormous altar to the sun god Ra. The chief sanctuary lies axially in the rear of the upper court, cut deep into the rock. It is the climatic point of the temple. This sanctuary is dedicated to the god Ammon, to whom Hatshepsut had dedicated the temple as a garden for her father. The chamber was a chapel which hosted the bark of Ammon and a skylight that allowed light to flood onto the statue of Ammon. The walls depict scenes of offerings presented by Hatshepsut and Thutmose I to Ammon. There are Osiris statues of Hatshepsut in the corners, and statues of Ammon occupying the niches in the wall. There are also cartouches containing Hatshepsut's name flanked and guarded by those of Ammon-Ra. So Hatshepsut didn't have to build a pyramid, she used nature as her pyramid, and simply embedded the temple within it. You can even see the similarity of the procession when you look at the section of the temple next to the section of the Great Pyramid of Giza. So if you look at the plan of the Hatshepsut temple in comparison with this great temple at Karnak, you can see lots of similarities in spite of the extreme differences in terms of the sequence and the spaces. We've got the hypostyle hall. We don't exactly have pylons, but we have these thresholds that allow the pacing of the procession to be marked in an honorific architectural way. And look at that, it's so great. Look at the striations of the rock. The vertical striations on the rock seem to be clarifying and made architectural in these colonnades on the Hatshepsut temple. And this is really a kind of deliberate decision that's being made here, because across the river at the Amun-Ra temple, we have the same kind of papyrus columns and lotus columns that we saw really way back in Saqqara in Djoser's complex. But here it's stripped away, it's really abstracted, because it's not referring to the riverites, but it's referring to the rocks. Again, it's mimetic of nature, but it's just picking up a different piece of nature to respond to. The overall design of the temple of Hatshepsut was doubtless inspired by the neighboring temple of Mentuhotep, built about 500 years earlier, although Hatshepsut's temple is considerably larger and grander. The tomb of Mentuhotep II is an exceptional work of architectural innovation, combining temple and tomb chamber in a single composition. The complex, approached by an axial route from the Nile, had 2 levels of colonnaded terraces surrounding a small, completely solid pyramid, raised aloft on a high podium. The pyramid is really a cenotaph, for the rock below is a dummy burial chamber approached by an irregular passage from the forecourt. In the rear of the temple is another pillared hall recessed into the rock face, preceded by an open court, from the center of which a ramp leads down to the Mentuhotep's long corridor tomb. The 2 levels of columns seen upon approach anticipate Greek temples with their surrounding colonnades. Mentuhotep's tomb would serve as a prototype for the more elaborate adjoining funerary complex built by the New Kingdom pharaoh Hatshepsut. The pyramid has more recently been interpreted as a flat-roofed hall. The building is a ruin today, so one cannot be sure of the initial design. But the case for a flat-roofed hall is based on there being insufficient foundations to support even a modest pyramid. You can see here the transformation of the type from typical Egyptian temples to Hatshepsut's temple. It conserves things like the hypostyle hall and the sanctuary, and the series of thresholds, but they are presented in a different way. Here you can see this really abstracted columnar edge. It seems really minimalist, insofar as it is very abstracted and horizontal, and you can see every pure geometry clearly, with no ornamentation nor column capitals. And here we have another column detail, which is quite interesting because it almost looks Greek. It almost looks like it's a kind of Doric column. There are vertical lines like the fluting, and there are little column capitals that are kind of like the Doric column capital. Of course, anticipating the Greek Doric by a long time. And here's an example of Greek Doric columns from the Stoas of Attalos in Athens. You can see the great similarity in the fluting and in the capitals. There is a statue of Osiris attached in the front of several columns from the 3rd level of Hatshepsut's temple. Osiris was the Egyptian god of fertility, resurrection, and of the underworld. This statue of Osiris has the delicate features of Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh. He wears the double crown of Egypt and a false beard with a curved tip. Although Hatshepsut reigned and died peacefully, her successors did everything possible to eradicate her memory, erasing her name from inscriptions and smashing almost all of her sculptural representations. The Temple of Hatshepsut can be seen from Thebes from the other side of the river, and completely dominates all the mortuary temples in honor of the rest of the pharaohs. And even today, the funerary temple of Hatshepsut, that is all this extension here, is considered one of the most spectacular monuments in all of pharaonic Egypt. The entire setting of the temple, from the axial ramp approach to the termination of the processional way at a false door, painted on the wall of the final rock-hewn sanctuary, is a masterly blending of architecture into a dramatic landscape. Thank you so much for watching. Visiting the Temple of Hatshepsut was an amazing experience, as well as visiting other parts of Egypt. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel, where you can find videos about Egypt, about Rome, and about many other fascinating places of the world. And if you'd like to support me on Patreon so that I can continue to produce these videos, that will be much appreciated. Thank you again, and I'll see you very soon with a new video. Goodbye.
Ini Hatshepsut, aku nggak ngerti bacanya nih. Nah, kemudian ini karya arsitektur lain yang tadi yang kalau di Indonesia kan namanya Lembah Para Raja gitu. Lembah Gerbang Para Raja, wilayah di Mesir, 50, hampir 500 tahun dari dinasti ke-8 di dekat Sungai Nil lagi. Nah, ini Lembah Para Rajanya. Ini penjelasannya, terdiri 120 ruangan dengan putra-putri Ramses dan sebagainya. Sudah dieksplorasi sejak akhir abad ke-18 gitu ya pemakamannya. Kemudian dia menjadi warisan astagfirullah. Dia menjadi warisan UNESCO, situs warisan dunia UNESCO. Kemudian penggalian dan konservasinya, kemudian ini adalah dia ditemukan gitu ya, ada lapisan-lapisan tanah ini. Dasar lembahnya itu terdiri atas lapisan-lapisan tanah, tebing gitu ya, yang tersusun satu sama lain di dasar lembah. Jadi ini bukan kesatuan, jadi dia kayak ada lapisan-lapisan begitu. Dengan apa namanya, dengan elemen tadi kita ingat kan, dia ditinggali apa namanya, ditinggali mineral. Nah ternyata itu mineralnya itu nggak cuma satu, jadi mungkin beberapa kali banjir itu dengan jenis mineral yang berbeda. Nah itu betapa menggambarkan perubahan alam yang terjadi dalam lapisan-lapisan tanah di Bukit Para Raja ini ya, the Valley of Bukit Lembah Para Raja.
During the Old Kingdom of ancient Egypt, the time of the construction of the pyramids, the main divinity was Ra, god of the sun. The pyramids and the way the Egyptians buried themselves were dedicated to him. In the Middle Kingdom was spread the cult of a god called Ammon, god of the hidden and patron of the city of Thebes. In the Old Kingdom, the royal capital of Egypt was in Memphis, and on the western bank of the Nile in Memphis, the pyramids of Saqqara and the pyramids of Giza were built, the great tombs of the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom. During the Middle Kingdom, the capital was relocated to Thebes, and on the western bank of the Nile in Thebes, the tombs of the pharaohs of the New Kingdom were built. In this aerial view of Thebes, you can see that there is a green area into which the Nile River flooded every year. And right behind this area, the funerary temples of the different pharaohs of the New Kingdom were built. Beyond them, you can find these spectacular cliffs, beyond of which is a hidden valley known as the Valley of the Kings, where you'll find all the tombs in which the mummies of these pharaohs were buried. It seems that these tombs do not have any similarity or connection with the pyramids of the Old Kingdom built 1,000 years before. However, the architectural diagram of the tombs that were in the pyramids is the same diagram of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. The tombs of the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom had the tomb where the pharaoh's mummy was placed, the pyramid, and they also had two temples, the High Temple and the Low Temple, where funerary ceremonies were made and offerings were brought to the pharaoh's spirit. That program is still applied in the New Kingdom, but the pharaoh's mummy, instead of being deposited in a pyramid, is now deposited in an underground tomb called Hypogeum, located in the Valley of the Kings. While in the Old Kingdom, Ra, god of the sun, was worshipped with a pyramid, in the New Kingdom, Ammon, god of the hidden, was worshipped with a hypogeum. And so the pharaohs began to bury themselves in structures excavated in the earth. Most of the tombs of the Old Kingdom, including the pyramids of Giza, were robbed before the Middle Kingdom, so this would also serve to prevent thieves from robbing the tombs of the pharaohs. The concept is the same, however. We have a place where the mummy is deposited and a temple of easy access, where offerings such as food and clothing can continue to be taken. Each tomb in the Valley of the Kings had its own mortuary temple on the outside so that the offerings could be placed. Among those temples was the temple of Amenhotep III. He built these huge statues known as the Colossi of Memnon. The name comes from a Greek legend that said that the statues were the portrait of a prince named Memnon, who was the son of the dawn. And every time the dawn touched their heads, the statues began to cry, greeting her mother. The truth is that these statues were raised by Pharaoh Amenhotep III and constitute a small part of his enormous mortuary temple. These were at the entrance to the temple, and it was one of the largest temples of the New Kingdom. Today the temple has been lost and the only thing that remains are the colossi. So when you stand in front of them, you have to picture the statues with a huge Egyptian temple behind. With all that said, let's take a look at some of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Up until now, 63 tombs have been discovered, although the site is always under excavation as new things are constantly being found. The cliffs in the back, called Theban Hills, are dominated by a peak, known to the ancient Egyptians as Tadehend. Due to its pyramid-shaped appearance, it is probable that this echoed the pyramids of the Old Kingdom 1,000 years earlier. The valley was used for burials from approximately 1539 to 1075 BC. On the outside of the tombs, the only thing visible from them is this large entrance that used to be covered by dirt and sand. Something incredible about these tombs is how deep they are excavated. Some of them have tunnels that are hundreds of meters long, and these tunnels are completely engraved with inscriptions in Egyptian hieroglyphics and with scenes from ancient Egypt, some better preserved and others quite deteriorated. The best part of these tombs is that, unlike the Egyptian temples, these spaces were completely sealed and isolated from the outside world for thousands of years. And thanks to this, the pigments with which they colored the walls, the columns, and the ceilings are preserved. This is the tomb of Pharaoh Meremptah, and from the entrance you can already start to see these colorful carvings on the rock. This tomb is from the 19th dynasty, and the walls are decorated with ancient Egyptian texts, the pharaoh with the gods, and some astronomical scenes. The tombs had several chambers and several rooms for the placement of goods and offerings. And at the end of the 160-meter corridor is the burial chamber, and it originally had 4 nested sarcophagi with the pharaoh's mummy inside. Here's a diagram of the whole tomb, and you can see all the small secondary chambers, and you can appreciate how deep into the earth they excavated for the making of these tombs. This is a tomb of Pharaoh Ramesses I, also from the 19th dynasty. You can see that it is much smaller than the one we saw before because it was a hasty burial. And one particular thing about it is that although it is a small tomb, the pigments on the walls are perfectly preserved. They are decorated with the Book of Gates, an ancient text that narrates the passage of a newly deceased soul into the next world. You can also see the pharaoh with the gods Horus and Anubis. You can see that the interior of River Hut architecture is still being imitated in the form of the space and in the paintings. The intensity of the colors inside this tomb is so impressive, and almost every detail of the painting can be appreciated perfectly. It is as if you traveled 3,000 years into the past. This is the tomb of Ramesses IX from the 20th dynasty. And again, you can see a lot of the colors and hieroglyphic carvings on the walls as well as the ceiling. There is a profuse decoration of many representations of Ramesses IX with Ra, Horus, Osiris, and other gods. There are also representations of parts of the Book of Caverns, the Book of the Dead, and several other ancient Egyptian funerary texts. This one's more than 100 meters cut into the mountain. It's very deep. The burial chamber has a large pit in the center where the huge nested sarcophagi were placed. Finally, we have the tomb of King Tutankhamun, one of the many sons of Pharaoh Akhenaten. Tutankhamun died at age 19. He accomplished nothing of significance. He was minor as far as history is concerned. But what's interesting about King Tut, and what makes him so famous, is that he managed to not get his tomb robbed, and everybody else's tomb got robbed. So in the early 20th century, British archaeologist called Howard Carter, with a bunch of other archaeologists, found the undisturbed tomb of King Tutankhamun with all his treasures inside, all completely intact. Tutankhamun tomb is actually a small space. Now over 3,300 years old, the paintings are still vibrant in color. There's a bright yellow background depicting scenes of his journey into the afterlife. Other than his stone sarcophagus that you see over here. All of the objects and artifacts found in the tomb of Tutankhamun and the other tombs are today in the Egyptian Museum of Cairo, including Tutankhamun's golden death mask encrusted with precious stones, astonishing goods like furniture and canopic jars containing his organs, and his coffin made of 110 kilograms of solid gold. And of course his mummy, which today is actually kept inside of his tomb. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned and enjoyed the video. If you like Egypt, I have a full playlist with Egyptian architecture videos in my channel that you can see right here. Please support me with a like and comment what you think. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.
Ini kemudian ini yang apa ya, yang menjadi yang menjadi pembicaraan utama, yaitu kompleks kuil Karnak, terdiri dari gabungan kuil, ada tiang, ada kapel, ada bangunan lain di dekat Luxor. Ini sejarahnya. Area di sekarang adalah tempat yang paling terpilih, jadi ini prime location. Dia tempat pemujaan juga, kemudian makam juga dan sebagainya. Dia juga masuk di dalam daftar warisan dunia. Itu. Nah, mari kita lihat videonya. Nah, kayak gini. Jadi dia bentuknya jadi artinya adalah ada yang mengartikan dia sebagai desa yang dibentengi. Jadi mari kita lihat tipikalnya yang berbeda. Bentar, kita cek dulu masih berapa materi. Oh, ini kita waktunya kurang 10 menit.
Luxor's other great site, another magnificent temple complex, is
Ya enggak berarti. Oke, saya ulangi ya.
Luxor's other great site, another magnificent temple complex, is best enjoyed early in the morning, beating the heat and crowds. An avenue of battered sphinxes leads to the awe-inspiring main entrance, heralding the temples of Karnak. Karnak was the most important place of worship in all Egypt. Back when Luxor was Egypt's capital, this sprawling complex of temples was dedicated to the grandiose Holy Family, a trinity of gods, Amen, Mut, and Khonsu. It was built over many centuries throughout this New Kingdom period when most of the great and famous kings ruled. The Great Court is the largest single area of the complex. It was used once a year for an elaborate festival feast celebrating fertility. Fertility of the land, the people, and the kingdom. The great hypostyle hall with over 100 columns is one of the grandest religious structures ever built. Its forest of columns represents papyrus plants, bulging stems and flowering capitals, each elaborately carved and once brightly painted. The many columns of this vast hall once supported a stone ceiling. You can measure the architectural sophistication of a society by the distance it can span between columns. This was the best they could do 3,000 years ago. The columns were fat and close together, making the gap easier to span.
Imagine what it took to build all this. They had to design it, quarry the stones, ship them, stack them, smooth them, carve them, paint them, all for the glory and favor of the gods. Consider the depth of the faith. This was not for the public. It was only to be seen by the royals, the priests, and the gods.
Obelisks symbolically connected Earth with the gods. These are monolithic and carved out of a single piece of granite. They were quarried about 100 miles south of here in Aswan and then shipped down the Nile. This one's been standing here for about 3,000 years.
Like church spires and minarets, an obelisk marked a holy place. There are only about 60 in existence. A few still mark their original Egyptian temples, but more decorate the great squares of Europe, taken there through the ages by European conquerors.
As you venture farther into the complex, things get older and crescendo in religious importance. Everything at Karnak leads to a small chamber that marks the very heart of the temple complex, the Holy of Holies.
This was the most sacred spot in all of Egypt. On this pedestal sat a statue of the top god, Amun-Ra. Amun-Ra was the god of Luxor, the god of empire, Egypt's god of gods.
Ini sudah. Yang terakhir ini adalah Abu Simbel. Nanti setelah Abu Simbel adalah kesimpulan. Abu Simbel, saudara-saudara, dia bentuknya kembar gitu ya. Kemudian tadilah ini sejarah-sejarahnya. Ini juga diakui oleh UNESCO. Jadi dia dibikinnya itu memang twin gitu ya. Kemudian direlokasi tahun 68 ke tempat yang lebih tinggi agar tidak terendam. Jadi sudah sebagian sudah tidak otentik lagi, tapi dia dibangun 13 tahun sebelum Masehi. Abad ke-13 sebelum Masehi. Oke, ini contoh yang terakhir. Abu Simbel. Kenapa bertuang-tuang toh?
Just a short distance from the border with Sudan, on the shores of Lake Nasser, sits one of the most breathtaking archaeological sites in all of Egypt, the twin temples of Abu Simbel. The Abu Simbel temple is incredible on the outside and just as breathtaking on the inside. Its perfect combination of massive size and incredible beauty make it a temple worthy of the gods, and for a pharaoh who wanted everyone else to consider him a god as well. The modern story of Abu Simbel is just as fascinating as the ancient one. In 1964, with the construction of the Aswan High Dam, the Egyptian authorities realized that the rising waters of the Nile that would eventually become Lake Nasser threatened to destroy this incredible complex. Rather than risk the destruction of the Abu Simbel temples, one of the greatest feats of archaeological engineering ever undertaken was begun. Egyptian authorities disassembled the temples and the hills that encompassed them one stone by one stone, and then moved them over 200 feet up the Nile banks into the place that they now sit, where they reassembled them piece by piece exactly as they had seen them before, including the fallen statue of Ramses that sits to the left of the entrance of the temple of Ramses II. Now these huge temples look out over Lake Nasser, which thanks to the high dam in Aswan is one of the largest man-made lakes in the world.
Abu Simbel has the largest man-made lake.
A look inside the temples of Abu Simbel will make it pretty clear that these beauties are not just skin deep. The Temple of Ramses II is as amazing inside as it is outside. It even has one of the earliest known attempts at depicting motion in a still image. At the back of the temple, you'll find seated statues of Ra-Harakti, Ramses II, Amun-Ra, and Ptah, 4 Egyptian gods. Twice a year, at just the right time, the light would bathe through the entrance of the temple and illuminate the statues with golden light, except for the statue of Ptah, the god of the underworld. He would remain in darkness. Sitting right beside the great temple of Ramses II sits one of only 2 temples in Egypt that are dedicated to the wife of a pharaoh, Ramses II's favorite wife, Queen Nefertari. But what makes this temple so unique is it's the only temple that depicts a pharaoh and his wife as equals. Both statues are the same height. The small temple might not be as majestic as the great temple, but it is just as intricately designed inside and shows off some spectacular scenes of music, dancing, and praise of the Egyptian gods. Our short visit to Abu Simbel gave us some of the most incredible scenery in all of our travels through Egypt. But before the day was done, we had to make it back to Aswan, because that night we had a 9th birthday to celebrate. I want to give another shout out to our partners while we were in Egypt, Traveline Egypt. They made our visit through the country absolutely incredible and super easy. I highly recommend checking them out if you're considering making a family trip to Egypt. Make sure you subscribe and like, and we'll see you next time on The Wandering Waggers.
Oke, ya ini adalah apa namanya kesimpulannya ya. Tadi kita sudah menjelajahi Luxor, Hatshepsut, Lembah Raja, kemudian Arnak dan Abu Simbel. Ini tadi tujuan pembuatannya bisa dengan apa namanya pemakaman. Tujuannya tadi kita memaunya ini dekorasinya. Kamar mayat, dekorasinya lampu makam raja. Ini nanti materinya kalau udah selesai besok saya share untuk tadi. Tapi apa namanya? Yang mungkin yang penting adalah yang rangkuman ini karena kalian akan mengerjakan tugas kalian sendiri. Adakah pas tepat jam 12 nggak? Oke, saya akhiri perkuliahannya. Sampai ketemu
berikutnya. Terima kasih.